As Democrats gather in Chicago for their national convention, outside of the arena, protests continued for a second day. Police say at least 4 people were arrested after some demonstrators breached a security fence. Now, this year's DNC is bringing back old memories of the 1968 convention for some, and that is when police responded to protests with severe violence. Now, similar to 2024, we can show you some examples on this screen. 1968 was a tumultuous year in American politics for all of these reasons. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated within just a few months of each other. A growing anti-war movement had formed over American involvement in the Vietnam War. There were several years of vocal student protests, which included violent skirmishes with police, and there was discontent within the Democratic National Party. But so far, other aspects have been much different. For example, there were violent police and protester interactions in Chicago that week in 1968. The Battle of Michigan Avenue on the convention's third night garnered the most media attention. During that battle, which started in Grant Park, demonstrators launched sticks and bricks at officers, and for hours after, police responded with a level of violence that a government report commissioned afterward called a, quote, police riot. Inside the convention, things were not much better. Delegates physically and verbally attacked one another on the floor of the DNC throughout that week. And you can see in these images that included CBS News' Mike Wallace and Dan Rather as they got caught in the violence as police responded to the skirmishes.
Mayhem on Michigan Avenue. Outside the 1968 Democratic National Convention, Mayor Richard Daley's police thumped protesters in downtown Chicago.
They jabbed nightsticks into stomachs and skulls.
We were demonstrating, and it was basically an attack.
You can see Michael James, now 82, in this famous photograph. Protesters surrounding a police van.
The myth has persisted over the years that we tipped it over. We did not. We rocked it.
Was it scary?
Terrifying.
In 1968, Bill Ayers was a leader in Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS.
They beat me up right there, took me to Cook County Jail, and I was there overnight.
56 years later, no one is expecting that level of volatility or violence at this year's convention. But here's what's striking: the connection between yesterday's protesters and today's.
We learned a lot from them, the way that they protest and the way that they take the streets.
Celia Nims, 26, is an organizer in the new SDS. We invited her and Ayers, now 79, for a talk about protest movements then and now.
Can you imagine trying to organize these demonstrations without cell phones, without social media?
Different generation, different time, different technology for sure.
It's a different generation, but I think the moral energy is very similar. I'm looking uneasily at the world, as we all should, and then we should do something about it.
Their targets in both eras, Democrats, the party in power at the White House, and the driving issue again, a war. In 1968, Vietnam. In 2024, Gaza.
What are some of the similarities, would you say, between then and now?
We're anti-war, we're anti-intervention, we're opposed to U.S. violence.
And we have the huge outpouring of women's rights, people refusing to go back into the closet. And the themes that we were fighting about 60 years ago are still true.
Chicago police have trained on de-escalation tactics for a year to prepare for this convention.
We're planning to have a family-friendly protest.
Neither one of you is anticipating a repeat of the mayhem.
We don't want a police riot, but that doesn't mean it won't happen.
Michael James these days is an author, a photographer, but a protester emeritus.
I'm going to leave it to others to raise criticisms of the Democratic Party.
Bill Ayers and his wife, Bernadine Dorn, spent 11 years on the run, wanted in connection with a series of bombings of public buildings. She eventually pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. Like Celia Nims, Ayers says he's demonstrating in Chicago this week.
If you're not angry, you're not paying attention. But if you're only angry, you won't get to where we need to go. Only love and generosity will do that.
This week, Chicago reconnects with America's partisan divide, then and now. For Eye on America, I'm Mark Strassman in Chicago.
On a quiet August day in Chicago's Grant Park, it's hard to imagine this spot was once a bloody battlefield. 50 years ago was a time when civil rights were legal, but the resistance was lethal. A time of war and body counts and assassinations. Mike James was in Chicago.
We were for peace. We were for ending the war. I'm the guy in the black leather jacket with the blonde hair, longer blonde hair.
He was one of about 10,000 demonstrators, yippies, hippies, and others, who intersected with thousands of Chicago cops and National Guardsmen. A flammable mix on Michigan Avenue that would later be called a police riot. CBS News cameraman Del Hall wasn't doing anything wrong during a march. Filming?
Yes, filming.
But he wound up on the wrong end of a police baton.
I really believe I was the first person hit, but I was not the last person.
At the Democrats' convention 5 miles away, reporters were roughed up.
Take your hands off of me unless you plan to arrest me.
And anchors were ruffled.
I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, Dan.
Chicago Alderman Ed Burke was a cop inside the convention hall.
A tea kettle has to let off steam someplace. And I think the nation let off that steam here in the heartland in Chicago.
For many, Chicago in the summer of '68 was a lesson in bad behavior on both sides.
It was in a sense, a watershed year, never to be repeated, hopefully.
It may be worth thinking about 1968 amid today's deep divisions, and remember how the country once looked when the whole world was watching. Dean Reynolds, CBS News, Chicago.